Well, first and foremost, I think it's the best thing to happen to Africa because, as intra-regional trade in Africa is very, very small. It's only about 15 to 18%. If you compare that to, Europe, you have about almost 69% of intra-regional trade. You look at the whole issue of Latin America, maybe about another 59%. In Asia, maybe about almost 41%. So we need to actually boost intra-regional trade. And the more you boost intra-regional trade, the more you reduce your vulnerability and vulnerabilities to global shocks that happens, geopolitical tensions that affect global supply chains and things like that. So it's very, very important. So you're looking at an Africa Continental Free Trade Area that will link together economies worth about $3.3, $3.4 trillion. It is the largest free trade zone in the world in terms of number of countries that are participating. So for us at the African Development Bank, integrating Africa is one of our high five priorities of the bank. And we've been doing this for a long time, even before the Africa Continental Free Trade Area was established. And so for us, we've invested in the last 7 years alone well over $44 billion in infrastructure, in ports, in rail, in airports, in digital infrastructure, in making sure that you have means in which people can actually move, mobility and for trade and services. So we've been doing that quite a lot. For the Africa Continental Free Trade Area, Secretariat itself, the African Development Bank provided $5 million for the establishment of that Secretariat that's based in Accra, so we're very pleased with that. We just provided them recently just another grant, just last year, December, another grant for about $11 million to help them to continue to build their capacity to implement the agreements under the Africa Continental Free Trade Area. And of course, we continue to strengthen the AU itself, the African Union Commission. We just did about almost a $12 million grant for them to institutional strengthening grant to support them in the rollout of Agenda 2063, of which, of course, the Africa Continental Free Trade Area is an important one. So we got to trade, but at the end of the day, if we trade, we have to also make sure people can move. And so at the African Development Bank, we've been supporting a Africa Visa Index, which tells you how easy it is or how difficult it is for people to move between one country and the other. And we are seeing improvements in the ease of movement in Africa. But I can tell you, much still needs to be done because if people can't move, they can't trade. Well, first and foremost is that, the bank, to be able to trade a lot, you need trade finance, actual trade finance. And the bank has a big program on trade finance. Our trade finance program has supported more than 1,900 transactions with more than 1,300 financial institutions in 32 countries for a total of about roughly $7 billion in trade finance. So trade finance is important. We do quite a lot also in supporting small and medium-sized enterprises. Most of those that trade that we talk about are not just the big companies. They're the small and medium-sized enterprises. So we give a lot of financing to commercial banks and other financial institutions in Africa for on-lending to small and medium-sized enterprises that are in that area. And of course, most of the trade you also see is informal trade. So the bank supports quite a lot of work to move a lot of the traders from informality towards the formal sector. So making sure that you're providing right information, training people in terms of what they need to be able to trade and what the protocols are, and also making sure that most of the people that are trading are women, that it is safe for them to walk in corridors, to trade in corridors, and that they are fully well informed about what they need to do, to move from one border to the other. And for us, we continue to invest heavily in one border post that facilitates a lot of this. And the last thing I'll just say on that is integrating the financial markets themselves, because you can trade, but you need money to be able to invest from one country to the other across the region. So the African Development Bank is leading massively on the integration of the capital markets, stock exchanges actually, all across Africa. So from Johannesburg Stock Exchange to Nairobi Stock Exchange to the Lagos Stock Exchange, and also to the stock exchange in Cairo Stock Exchange. So integrating financial markets is also part of what we do, apart from trade finance. Africa I want to say that, people talk about challenges of Africa. I'm not going to deny that we have challenges. But I like also to talk about opportunities that Africa has. You take a look at Africa today, we just released our macroeconomic outlook report for Africa. And what it shows is that, African economies in terms of GDP growth rate, they are growing at, 4% this year and next year. When you take a look at what the growth rate is globally for the world is, this year it's about 2.7%, next year will be about 3.2%. So in a way, Africa is growing and it's, one of the principles in swimming is if you can keep your head above water, it's always good. So Africa's head is well above water in a world where you have geopolitical risk, disruptions of supply chains and rising debt levels and depreciation of many currencies and so on. So Africa is doing quite well. In fact, 50 of the 52 countries in Africa that we looked at have posted positive growth rates, and we expect that 5 of the 10 fastest growing economies in the world will be African countries again, so which is very, very important in terms of that. But there are broader issues also for Africa. Take the case of electricity. The bank's work on, Light Up and Power Africa is having huge, huge impact. In the last 5-6 years that we've been doing this, we've connected well over 20 million people to electricity. And I can, one of such experiences, I'm right here in Ethiopia. We're supporting Ethiopia with a transmission line that goes all the way from here, that goes all the way to both Somalia and Djibouti, providing electricity. In fact, you make more money today in terms of export of electricity than anything else. So we invest in transmission lines all across countries to be able to take power out. We also invest heavily in renewable energy. Today we are investing in what is called desert to power. Desert to power is to provide 10,000 megawatts of solar all across the 11 countries of the Sahelan part of Africa. And you know what that's going to do? It's going to provide electricity for 250 million people. And that will become the largest solar zone in the world. So we are leading when it comes to that particular issue of energy. Now, we take the case of another part of our work is on agriculture, which is to feed Africa. And we are having tremendous successes, starting from your country, right here in Ethiopia, where we supported the Prime Minister and his government to have access to heat-tolerant wheat varieties in the Ethiopian lowlands. And these varieties, Ethiopia started cultivating them on 5,000 hectares in 2018. And when I spoke to the Prime Minister, you are at 1.4 million hectares. Ethiopia, for the first time in history, is now a net exporter of wheat. Just imagine how that is. So the African Development Bank, we put together, myself and the President, Macky Sall of Senegal, the chair of the outgoing chair of the African Union, we put together a Feed Africa Summit in Dakar last year, at which we had 34 heads of state and government that came to something. That tells you that our leaders are very focused on making sure that Africa can feed itself. And we developed plans for Africa to do that. And guess what? We were able to mobilize $36 billion towards that. And we at African Development Bank put up $10 billion towards the execution of those plans. And then we mobilized the world around us to put in another $26 billion. So that's great. But you know that when we talk about food, we're talking in a situation of geopolitical risk because of the war of Russia in Ukraine, which has actually driven up energy prices, driven up the price of wheat and maize. And Africa imports quite a lot of that. And so the issue is, how is this going to affect Africa's import demand from those countries? And to mitigate that impact, we put in place a $1.5 billion Africa Emergency Food Production Facility that will quickly support African farmers, about almost 28 million farmers, to produce food valued at $12 billion. So I'm pretty confident that with our support, both in the short term and medium term that we are doing, that Africa will not have a food crisis. But we have to start taking agriculture very seriously, that you have to be able to feed yourself. I don't see how you can develop with pride if you don't feed yourself. Ethiopia is really fundamental. I love Ethiopia, and I'm a great supporter of Ethiopia and its prime minister. You have a very dynamic prime minister. And our operations here is about $1.3 billion that we have, out of about 22 operations, largely in energy sector, transport sector, water and sanitation, and infrastructure, as you rightly mentioned. And some of the exciting projects that I see here, first is the development of the special agro-industrial processing zones that you have all across the country, where you can process and add value to agricultural products. That's one. The second one, of course, is the power transmission lines that I just mentioned to you, that we have the regional power transmission line that goes all the way from here to Djibouti and also to Somalia, and even all the way to Sudan, by the way, as well. And Ethiopia now can sell electricity also in East Africa Power Pool to Kenya, again from here. So a big component of our work in Ethiopia. Now, the other area where we're also investing heavily in Ethiopia is the digital economy, because, as you know, the economies are becoming much more digital. The Prime Minister is opening up the economy, so we're investing quite a lot in digital infrastructure in the country. Now, one other area I will also say is water. Water has become a big issue. I think it's called the Borona area. It's a very, very dry area. So we are supporting significant work in making sure that people can have access to water and sanitation. I'm amazed with what has been able to be done in the urban area of Addis Ababa. We've provided a lot of work for urban upgrade infrastructure right here, and I'm delighted to see how beautiful the city looks like. Climate change is killing Africa. When I go, I look at our pastoralists, whether it's here, whether it's in Somalia, whether it's in Sudan, whether it's in the Sahel or in Kenya, you find them losing all their animals. I was talking to somebody recently today who told me that the Maasai, he went to a place in the Maasai, and the Maasai in Kenya, they haven't had rain for more than 5 seasons. All right. So Africa is losing about $7 to $15 billion a year to climate change. And if that doesn't change, it's going to rise to about $50 billion a year by 2030, just 7 years from now. So building climate resilience is a critical part for Africa. Now, I am delighted that, for Africa, the African Development Bank has always been there. We are leading the world today in terms of climate adaptation. In fact, 67% of all our financing for climate is devoted to adaptation, because Africa's real need is adaptation. We only emit only 3% of global greenhouse gases, but we suffer disproportionately from the negative consequences of it. And so, at 67% of our financing go to climate adaptation, we are the leader globally when it comes to adaptation financing. In addition to that, we launched what is called the African Adaptation Acceleration Program, which is a program jointly with the Global Center on Adaptation, working together with the former UN Secretary General Ban Ki-moon and Professor Bakwijian on that, to mobilize $25 billion for climate adaptation in Africa. Well, we are Africa's premier financial institution, so we put our money where our mouth is. So we put down already $12.5 billion out of that $25 billion. And now we're trying to raise more money for that. Now, one way for low-income countries, as you mentioned, is that they also need to be able to insure themselves against these extreme weather patterns, from drought to floods. And so what we've done is that we set up something called the Africa Disaster Risk Insurance Facility, which actually allows us just to insure the countries. So if you have a flood that damages your crops or damages your infrastructure, you get a payout, for that, which is, so it's an insurance mechanism that helps the countries to insure themselves against catastrophic risk events. It's working very, very well. It's working very well in many of the countries that we've done it. And because we are here in the Horn of Africa, I have to say that, building more resilient systems, ecosystems is very, very important. So we have a big program that we have here with IGAD, with Ethiopia, with Kenya, with Somalia, Sudan, all these countries, to build more resilient systems, ecosystems here that can resist, at least a bit more resilient in the face of all of these exogenous shocks. But nonetheless, the developed world needs to help Africa out here And there's $100 billion that has been promised for a long time to Africa, to the world, developing countries. I think it's time for that be paid, because the people are suffering and they can't wait to get the help they need.